They never surrendered, and we buried every one of them. I can still feel the volcanic ash between my teeth, still smell the sulfur that gave that godforsaken island its name. Iwo Jima, Sulphur Island. For 36 days, it became our world, 8 square miles of hell where 29,000 Japanese defenders chose death over dishonor, and where we Marines learned that some victories cost more than defeats. My name is Sergeant Jack Morrison, and I was there from the first wave to the last shot fired. I survived what military historians would later call the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. This is my story. The morning of February 19, 1945, dawned clear and cold aboard the USS Bayfield. I stood at the rail with my squad, watching the island emerge from the pre-dawn darkness like a sleeping dragon. Mount Suribachi, that 550-foot extinct volcano, dominated the southern tip of the island, its slopes dark and foreboding against the lightening sky. "Doesn't look like much," whispered Private Tommy Chen, a 19-year-old kid from San Francisco who'd joined our squad just 2 months earlier. His hand shook as he checked his rifle for the 100th time. "It's not the size that matters, son," I replied, studying the island through my field glasses. "It's what's under it." For 72 hours, our Navy had pounded Iwo Jima with the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment in Pacific War history. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers had fired over 22,000 shells at the island. The 24 liberators had dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. The brass told us nothing could survive that kind of punishment. But I'd been fighting in the Pacific for 3 years now, Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Saipan. I knew the Japanese. They didn't build above ground anymore. They went deep, deeper than our shells could reach. And on Iwo Jima, they'd had 8 months to prepare. "Listen up." Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson gathered our company around him. Johnson was a tough Texan who'd earned his stripes at Saipan. "We're going in on Green Beach. 5th Division takes the left flank, 4th Division the right. Our job is to cut across the island's narrowest point and isolate Suribachi." The plan sounded simple enough. The island was only 4.5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide. Intelligence estimated 13,000 Japanese defenders. We were landing with 70,000 Marines. The numbers were in our favor, but numbers meant nothing to men who'd already decided to die. The first boats hit the water at 0500 hours. I climbed down the cargo net with my squad, Chen, Corporal Mike O'Brien from Boston, Private First Class Carlos Mendes from Texas, and 8 other Marines I trained with, fought with, and would die with over the next 5 weeks. The Higgins boat pitched and rolled in the 4-foot swells. Green-faced Marines clutched their rifles and tried not to lose their breakfast. The Navy coxswain, a kid who couldn't have been more than 18, kept checking his watch and squinting toward the island. 15 minutes to beach, he called out. That's when I saw them, the first casualties of the day. A landing craft about 50 yards to our port side suddenly erupted in a geyser of water and flame. It had hit a mine. Bodies flew through the air like rag dolls. The boat sank in less than 30 seconds. O'Brien muttered, crossing himself. The kid from San Francisco was turning white. "Sarge, maybe we should." "Stay focused, Chen," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Remember your training. Keep your head down and follow me." But even as I said it, I felt the familiar knot in my stomach. In 3 years of island fighting, I'd never seen anything like what we were sailing into. At 9:02 hours, our boat's bow scraped against the black volcanic sand of Green Beach. The ramp dropped with a metallic clang, and we charged into hell. The first thing that hit me was the sand. It wasn't sand at all. It was volcanic ash, fine as powder and dark as coal. With each step, I sank 6 inches deep. Running was impossible. The weight of our equipment, rifles, ammunition, water, medical supplies, made every step an ordeal. "Move! Move! Move!" I shouted, struggling through the ash toward the first terrace about 30 yards inland. For the first few minutes, it was almost quiet, too quiet. A few scattered rifle shots, the distant rumble of artillery, but nothing like the hell we'd expected. Some of the newer Marines started to relax. That's when the island exploded. The Japanese had waited. They'd watched us struggle through the ash, watched us cluster together on the narrow beach, watched us move exactly where they wanted us. Then General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the brilliant Japanese commander, unleashed everything he had. Artillery shells began falling like rain. Mortars whistled down from hidden positions. Machine guns opened up from concrete bunkers we couldn't even see. The volcanic ash that had slowed our advance now became a deadly cloud, churned up by explosions and mixed with smoke, blood, and death. "Take cover!" I screamed, but there was no cover. The beach was a killing field, swept clean by interlocking fields of fire from positions built into the rock itself. Chen went down first. A mortar round landed 10 feet away, and shrapnel tore through his chest. He looked at me with confused eyes, blood frothing from his mouth. "Sarge," he whispered. Then he was gone. I grabbed his rifle and ammunition, fury building inside me. We'd been on the island less than 10 minutes, and already I was losing my boys. O'Brien. "Mendes, on me," I shouted over the din of battle. We low-crawled toward the first terrace, dragging our wounded with us. Every yard was paid for in blood. The Japanese had turned the entire island into a fortress, with firing positions built into the volcanic rock itself. They could see us, but we couldn't see them. That's when I got my first glimpse of what we were really up against. About 50 yards to our left, a squad of Marines had reached the base of a small hill. They'd found what looked like a cave entrance and were preparing to assault it. The squad leader, a sergeant I recognized from the transport, pulled the pin on a grenade and lobbed it into the opening. The explosion echoed from deep inside the hill, but instead of silence, we heard something that made our blood run cold. The sound of metal doors slamming shut deeper in the tunnels. "They're underground," O'Brien gasped. "The whole island is hollow." He was right. What we didn't know then was that the Japanese had spent 8 months turning Iwo Jima into the most sophisticated fortress in military history. They dug 11 miles of tunnels, connecting over 1,500 underground rooms. They had hospitals, ammunition storage, command centers, and barracks all carved into the volcanic rock. They could move from one end of the island to the other without ever showing themselves above ground. And they'd prepared to die there. By nightfall of the first day, we'd advanced exactly 700 yards. It had cost us 2,400 casualties. The Japanese, invisible in their underground fortress, had lost perhaps 100 men. I spent that first night in a shell crater with what remained off my squad. O'Brien had taken shrapnel in the shoulder but was still fighting. Mendes had a concussion from a mortar blast. Of the 12 Marines who'd ridden the Higgins boat with me that morning, only 5 were still alive. "How do we fight ghosts, Sarge?" Mendes asked, his voice hollow. I didn't have an answer. The Japanese would pop up from spider holes, fire a few rounds, then disappear back into the rock. They'd open a firing port in what looked like solid stone, break us with machine gun fire, then seal it up again. We were fighting an entire island that had been turned into a weapon. That's when I first saw the flamethrowers. The next morning, engineers from the 5th Pioneer Battalion arrived with a new weapon, the M222 flamethrower. It looked like a backpack with a nozzle attached, but it was really a tool of hell. It could shoot liquid fire 40 yards and burn at 2,000 degrees. "Fire in the hole!" Corporal Jimmy Walsh from Detroit shouted as he aimed the nozzle at a cave entrance. The stream of fire shot into the darkness, and suddenly the mountain was screaming. The Japanese had built their fortress well, but they couldn't build it fireproof. The flames followed the tunnels, seeking out every pocket of air, every hiding place. Men who'd been invisible moments before came running out of the rock, their uniforms on fire. It was horrible, but it was also the only thing that worked. For the next week, we advanced yard by bloody yard. The flamethrowers became our most valuable weapon. When we found a cave entrance, we'd seal off the exits we could find, then pump fire into the tunnels. The Japanese inside had 2 choices: come out and fight or die in the dark. Most chose to die in the dark. "Banzai!" The scream came from a spider hole just 20 feet away. A Japanese soldier, his uniform singed and his face blackened with soot, charged straight at us with a bayonet. I put 3 rounds in his chest, but he kept coming. Only when O'Brien hit him with a burst from his bar did the enemy soldier finally go down. Even then, he tried to crawl toward us until Mendes finished him with his 45. "They're not human," O'Brien muttered, checking his wounded shoulder. But I knew better. They were human. That's what made it so terrifying. These weren't monsters. They were men who'd been told that death was preferable to defeat, that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. They'd been ordered to kill 10 Americans for every Japanese death, and they were trying to do exactly that. On February 23rd, we finally took Mount Suribachi. The famous flag raising that everyone would remember happened at 10:20 hours, and I was there to see it. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson had been right. We needed to isolate the mountain before we could take the rest of the island. But taking Suribachi was only the beginning. The real fortress lay in the island's center and northern end, where the Japanese had built their strongest positions. That's where we were headed next. The landscape looked like the surface of the moon. Constant bombardment had cratered the volcanic rock, creating a maze of holes and ridges. Every crater might hide a Japanese position. Every ridge might conceal a tunnel entrance. And the Japanese had connected it all with their underground network. "Movement at 2 o'clock, whispered Private Danny Sullivan, a replacement who'd joined us after Chen's death. He was a good kid from Chicago, quick with a rifle and steady under fire. I looked where he was pointing. A small opening in the rock face, barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. It looked empty, but I'd learned not to trust appearances on Iwo Jima. "Walsh, bring the flame," I ordered. Corporal Walsh moved forward with his flamethrower, 2 Marines covering him. He positioned himself about 15 feet from the opening and called out in Japanese, one of the few phrases we'd all learned. "Decoy! Come out!" Silence. Walsh triggered the flamethrower. The stream of liquid fire shot into the opening, and immediately we heard screaming from deep inside the rock. But instead of Japanese soldiers running out, we heard something else, the sound of explosions deep underground. "They're blowing the tunnels," O'Brien shouted. The ground beneath our feet shuddered. Smoke poured from cracks in the rock we hadn't even noticed. The Japanese weren't just dying in their tunnels, they were collapsing them, sealing themselves in their own tombs rather than surrender. That's when I realized the full scope of what we were fighting. This wasn't just a battle for an island. It was a battle against an entire culture that had chosen death over defeat. Every Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima knew he was never going home. They'd come here to die, and they were going to take as many of us with them as possible. The battle for the northern end of the island took 3 more weeks. 3 weeks of cave-by-cave fighting, of flamethrowers and explosives, of watching good Marines die for yards of worthless volcanic rock. We developed tactics as we went. When we found a tunnel system, we'd map it as best we could, then systematically clear it section by section. The engineers would blow holes in the rock to create new entrances. We'd pump and smoke to force the Japanese to reveal their positions. Then the flamethrowers would finish the job. But the Japanese had tactics too. They'd let us think we'd cleared a tunnel, then attack from positions we thought were secure. They'd use their underground network to move behind our lines, then attack our command posts and supply lines. They turned every cave into a fortress and every tunnel into a trap. The worst part was the waiting. You'd be crouched in a crater, and suddenly the ground would move. A spider hole would open right next to you, and a Japanese soldier would emerge with a grenade or a bayonet. You learned to sleep with one eye open, to trust nothing, to assume every piece of ground was hostile. By March 16th, we'd pushed the Japanese into the island's northeastern corner. Intelligence estimated that fewer than 3,000 of the original 22,000 defenders were still alive. But those 3,000 were fighting harder than ever. "Final assault tomorrow," Lieutenant Colonel Johnson told us that night. "We end this thing." I looked around at what remained of my squad. O'Brien was still with me, his arm in a sling, but his spirit unbroken. Mendes had been evacuated with a shattered leg. Sullivan had taken a bullet through the shoulder but refused to be evacuated. We'd picked up a few replacements, kids who'd never seen combat before, thrust into the worst fighting of the war. "What do you think, Sarge?" Sullivan asked. "Will they surrender when they see it's hopeless?" I thought about the past 4 weeks. The caves we'd sealed with fire. The tunnels we'd collapsed with explosives. The thousands of Japanese soldiers who'd chosen death over capture. No, I said quietly. They'll fight to the last man. The final assault began at dawn on March 17th. We'd cornered the remaining Japanese forces in an area of cliffs and caves at the island's northeastern tip. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. But cornered animals fight the hardest. The Japanese launched their final banzai charge at 0400 hours. 300 men, maybe more, came screaming out of the darkness. They had rifles, swords, sharpened bamboo spears, and anything else they could find. They knew they were going to die, but they were determined to die fighting. Here they come, someone shouted. The night erupted in muzzle flashes. Our machine guns cut down the charging Japanese in waves, but they kept coming. They climbed over the bodies of their dead comrades, still screaming, still fighting. I fired my M1 Garand until the clip pinged empty, then grabbed Sullivan's bar when he went down with a sword wound to the chest. The Japanese soldier who'd cut him down was still coming at me, his blade raised high. I put a burst into his chest, and he fell backward into the crater he'd climbed out of. But even as he died, he was trying to pull the pin on a grenade. O'Brien kicked the grenade away with his good arm, and it exploded harmlessly in the rocks. Crazy bastards, he muttered. The charge lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, the ground was covered with Japanese bodies. Not one had surrendered. Not one had retreated. They'd all died exactly where they'd chosen to make their stand. But we weren't done yet. The last pocket of resistance was a complex of caves about 200 yards from the beach. Intelligence estimated maybe 50 Japanese soldiers were still alive inside. After 34 days of fighting, 50 men didn't seem like much. We were wrong. The caves were deeper and more complex than anything we'd encountered before. The Japanese had built them as their final stronghold, with multiple levels, interconnected tunnels, and carefully prepared defensive positions. They had enough food, water, and ammunition to hold out for weeks. We're not going to dig them out, Colonel Johnson decided. We're going to bury them. The engineers brought up 8,000 pounds of explosives. We spent 2 days mapping the cave system, placing charges at key points. The idea was to bring down the inter-complex, sealing the Japanese inside their own tomb. But the Japanese weren't going to go quietly. As we worked, they kept shooting at us from hidden firing ports. They'd roll grenades down the tunnels. They'd wait until we were deep inside, then try to collapse sections behind us to trap us inside with them. On March 21st, we were ready to detonate the charges. The surviving Japanese soldiers knew what was coming. They could have surrendered. They could have come out and died fighting in the open. Instead, they chose to die buried in the rock. Fire in the hole, the demolition sergeant shouted. The explosion shook the entire island. The cave complex collapsed in on itself, sending up a column of dust and smoke that could be seen for miles. When it settled, there was nothing left but a pile of volcanic rock. Somewhere underneath, the last defenders of Iwo Jima had died as they had lived, without surrender, without compromise, without mercy. The battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945. 36 days of fighting had cost us 6,821 Marines killed and 19,217 wounded. Nearly one-third of all the Marines who'd landed on the island had become casualties. But the Japanese had lost everything. Of the 22,000 defenders who'd been on the island when we landed, only 216 were taken prisoner, and most of those were unconscious or too wounded to resist. The rest had died in their tunnels, their caves, their underground fortresses. They'd kept their word. They'd never surrendered, and we'd buried every one of them. I stood on the beach where we'd landed 36 days earlier, watching the last of the wounded being loaded onto hospital ships. The volcanic ash was still there, still black, still fine as powder. But now it was mixed with something else, the ashes of 22,000 men who'd chosen to die rather than give up. Was it worth it, Sarge? Sullivan asked. He'd survived his wounds and was going home with a Purple Heart and a discharge. I thought about the question. Intelligence had told us that Iwo Jima was strategically important, that we needed it as a base for B-29 bombers attacking Japan. that we needed it as an emergency landing field for damaged aircraft. Over the next few months, more than 2,400 B-29s would make emergency landings on the island we paid for in blood. But that wasn't really the answer Sullivan was looking for. "Ask me in 20 years, I said finally. "When we see what kind of world we've made." I made it home to Nebraska in the summer of 1945. The war ended 3 months after Iwo Jima fell, when the atomic bombs convinced Emperor Hirohito to surrender. I often wondered if those Japanese soldiers, dying in their tunnels, had known that their sacrifice would be meaningless, that Japan would surrender anyway, that their deaths would change nothing. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that they died as they had lived, loyal to their code, faithful to their emperor, true to their understanding of honor. They'd been wrong about a lot of things, but they'd been right about one thing. There are some things worth dying for. I kept in touch with O'Brien and Sullivan over the years. We'd get together every February 19th, the anniversary of the landing. We'd drink a toast to the Marines who hadn't made it home, and we'd try to make sense of what we'd experienced. The thing about war is that it changes you in ways you don't expect. You learn things about yourself, about courage, about fear, about what you're willing to do when everything depends on it. You learn things about your enemy too, about their courage, their dedication, their willingness to die for what they believe in. The Japanese on Iwo Jima had been our enemies, but they'd also been warriors. They'd fought with honor, even when their cause was hopeless. They'd chosen death over dishonor, sacrifice over surrender. In some strange way, we'd respected them for it. I'm an old man now, and most of the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima are gone. The island itself is back in Japanese hands, returned to them in 1968 as part of the peace treaty. There's a memorial there now, honoring both the American and Japanese dead. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I still dream about those tunnels. I still hear the screaming of the flamethrowers, still feel the volcanic ash between my teeth. I still see the faces of the Japanese soldiers we killed, and I still remember the faces of the Marines we lost. They never surrendered, and we buried every one of them. That's the story of Iwo Jima, not just the strategy, not just the tactics, but the human cost of victory. 29,000 Japanese soldiers died on that island, and 7,000 Americans died taking it from them. It was the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, and it was won yard by yard, cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel. We took the island because we had to. They defended it because they had to. In the end, we were all just young men, far from home, doing what we thought was right. The only difference was that we got to go home. In memory of the 6,821 Americans and 18,844 Japanese who died on Iwo Jima, February 19, March 26, 1945. May their sacrifice never be forgotten.